Hey, welcome back to Guardbro's Field Desk. I have for you Chapter 5 of Book 4. Let's get into it. Chapter 5, Chance of Rain. I've noticed a pattern when you join me in these little trips, Yule said, dragging his spoon along the bottom side of his wooden bowl to scrape the last of his porridge from the side of it. Alavara lifted her chin and closed her eyes, having already heard this thought before his lips had moved.
Oh? What would that be?
We seem to get attacked a lot when we travel together, Yule said with a low laugh, cleaning his spoon and then setting it down in his bowl. You got some kind of magical rune tattoo somewhere they keep tracking? Alavara leaned forward, resting an elbow on the table as she pointed her own spoon at Yule.
I'm pretty sure that if I had a tattoo, you would have found it by now with how much you gaze at me while I change.
Ick.
Eris whispered quietly to herself and hated the fact she couldn't turn her ears off. She looked over to Yethis and wagered the elf must have been thinking the same thing from the sour look on her face. While Eris was in the ballpark, she did not know that Yethis was more frustrated that Yule would never be gazing at her, a thought that earned a glint of evil-strung side-eye from Alavara. Chikily was too busy chewing through a mouthful of bread, and looked up lost as to why Alavara was glaring at Yethis or why Eris was looking into her mug of tea with a defiant
I'm not listening
tone.
Eh? Chikily missed something?
Nah, bud, Yule said, draining his own mug of tea and setting it down. You didn't miss anything. Eris fluffed out her feathers, wishing she had been as lucky as Chikily this morning when she had to walk by their room.
Are worse things than missing out on something. Chikily better off.
So, what are we doing today?
Alavara asked Yule, refilling her cup with a dark, mildly bitter bark brew that Staglings had brought with them. Yule pointed a finger at her. You are not doing anything. We're likely to get shelled today, and I want you as far away from that tree line as possible. Yethis is going to be performing medic duties on the line. Eris and Chikily are going to be airborne. And you have a meeting, Grouch said as he walked over towards their table, and Yule noted with visible distaste that he was wearing a fully wool kilt, along with his leather battle belt and fuzzy socks. I asked Roich about your thoughts when I saw him this morning. He wants to talk to you. Why won't you wear pants? Yule asked the human as Eris snickered behind her cup, though Yethis cleared her throat, trying to look anywhere but Grouch's knees. We have thousands of pairs of pants. You can take any pair. Grouch shrugged. I like my legs to breathe. Be thankful I'm not regimental under this thing.
Regimental?
Alavara asked Yule, but even though he waved her question away with a short, angry laugh, she knew full well what it meant due to Yule's thoughts and had to hide her bemused smile. Yule kissed Alavara, then got up from the table, making his way out of the inn with Grouch loitering at his side. You really sure about this trident thing? Grouch asked him, looking towards him with a bored look. Yule slid on his gloves, his own voice morose. No. I do know that we can't survive getting shelled to shit, and need to at least put some kind of pressure on them to ease their rate of fire. They'll get us eventually, Grouch said in agreement, tucking his hands into a muff he had bought from the locals and letting his rifle sit under his covered hands. We may hold out for a few more days, skirmishing out in the snow, but they'll get eyes on us one way or another. That's the plan, Yule said, both of their boots crunching through the frozen snow despite the warm sun on their faces. We skirmish, they find us, we fight, and in the fight we distract them long enough to send out that raiding party. Grouch raised his brows. On skis. Or sleds. I did mention sleds, Yule chided, holding up a gloved finger. Sleds or skis? Speaking of which, how many archers do we have? Grouch wagged his head from side to side slowly as he thought, then gestured with his muff towards the battle line. Maybe 20? Helena is out there somewhere, and she's a sure bet. I can go around and ask, though. Do so, Yule said, raising a hand and waving to the stagling he had been searching for. Elderman Roich. The stagling looked up from where he was shoveling, he and a few other locals filling spare bags with earth to protect their town's many shrines and statues. Roich set his shovel against the shrine itself and began walking over towards Yule as he called out, not even breaking a sweat despite his warm layers of clothing.
Ah, good morning, Warlord Yule.
Good morning, Warlord Yule. Yule muttered in a mocking voice, only loud enough so Grouch could hear, and the man stepped away with a muted chortle. Yule raised his voice to its usual tone as he moved to meet the stagling. Not a warlord, just a man.
A man with a very interesting idea,
Roich said, pulling up his own leather working gloves and tucking them into his muff, the hand warmer having been hanging from his belt.
Mr. Grouch has filled me in a little on your plan.
Yule had to fight in order to not laugh at Mr. Grouch, but held out his hand to take the one Roich had outstretched. It's a bad idea heaped onto a worse idea, but I don't think we have a choice.
The plumes of snow.
Roich said with a nod, letting go of Yule's hand.
How dangerous are they?
Yule sighed, crossing his arms over his heavy coat. They're bad. They have us kind of trapped here, and they have us outranged by a solid margin.
Outranged?
Roich asked, looking between the town and where he had last seen the plumes of snow.
They can't be too far away. Those plumes must have been landing merely between our lines.
Yule was confused for a second, but then remembered who he was talking to. Elderman, those weren't catapults or manual siege weapons, that was long-range artillery, and they are just about 12 miles away.
Miles?
Roich asked again, now clearly confused as he stared at Yule blankly. Yule twirled the open hand from his arms as he fought for the word. 12 Stilfum. Roich actually took a step back, looking both horrified and aghast.
12 Stelfum? How is such a thing possible? I thought they were just over the hills.
No, not in the least. They are 12 Stelfum away, lobbing explosive shells at us. They will have to find their range on us, and I believe they have already moved their artillery battery forward. Now they have to get eyes on us, Yule said slowly, making sure that Roich understood what he was saying. So the early part of this is going to be fighting out in the snow, small teams trying to deny access to our line of sight. Roich was quiet for a long time, slowly rolling his jaw as he thought, and he paced back and forth in the snow with measured steps. 2 minutes had passed before Roich turned back to Yule, who had been politely waiting.
Can they hit my town?
They might. We are pulled up to the tree line and have decoy trenches set out further towards the opposite edge of the tree line. If all goes well, they should shell either the decoy trenches or us, Yule said. Roich cocked his head, his antlers catching the light oddly.
You gave your enemy defenses?
Not quite, Yule said with a smile, pointing towards the actual gun line. Our line is 5 feet in the ground with fighting pits. The false line is roughly a foot in the ground with fake fighting pits. It won't offer them anything more than the trees will. Roich didn't seem convinced, his hands fidgeting in his hand muff.
I suppose it is too late to ask you to leave.
I'm afraid so, Yule said, not that he blamed the man for trying. But I have my warcasters providing some amount of shelter for the closer buildings.
Are we going to get a front row seat to this modern warfare?
Roich asked, gesturing for Yule to walk with him as he aimed them towards the trees.
I can say I have been curious to see how human warfare is fought, but I am already feeling far more distressed now than when I was in full armor, staring down the enemy line.
All things change in time, Yule said with a nod, falling into step beside him. And it is a high likelihood. Now, these opening moves are going to be subtle. I'll have forward scout units and recon units heading out into snowfields, watching for movement and for their forward observers getting into place. You will hear gunfire in the night and maybe our mortars firing. Roach said nothing as they continued walking down the road, keeping their voices low so the shopkeepers and homeowners wouldn't hear. When they cleared the front patio of people drinking tea, Roach continued speaking.
I'm sure you observed the merchants coming in last night?
I did, Yule muttered, here for the spectacle.
The town is quite full.
Roach said lowly again.
A tempting target.
Yule pressed his lips together, exhaling out his nose. It shouldn't come to that.
As for my fellow staglings, you are hunting volunteers for a mission.
Roach continued on, not even missing the beat of their conversation.
To attack these long-range weapons.
Yule nodded. Eventually, yes. We have to take our beating in order to lure them in, let them think they have weakened us. I may have to even open up a flank to try and entice them. Either way, when they are close, they'll have more space between themselves and their artillery. We can either harass them or destroy them. Hopefully.
You're going to need strong staglings to pull these sleds, or to men on their Shakashahayam. I know of a clan that still resides here that I can ask. They are brawnier than most.
Roach said with a bob of his head.
Though, what about the roads?
We will be trying to clear them still, Yule said, pointing down where he knew the felled trees were. It will just take time, and there will likely be fighting while we are trying to do it. Even still, we can't move until the skirmishing and shelling begins. Roach fixed his face.
Well, I shall be sure to tell Captain Jot to help defend the town as well as your men-at-arms do.
With nothing else to be said, the two men shook hands, Roach heading off to the stagling lodgings and Yule to his line. The gnolls, these Longclaws as they call themselves, were not as readily accepted by the auxiliaries as Yule had hoped, and were being ostracized as much as one could during a trench combat stance. Taking it in stride with resilience and temper that Yule was not used to, the gnolls were instead hanging around with the lone wanderers, still wearing nothing but their plate carriers and running shorts. Dubbed the Ranger Panty Party, these gnolls were already gearing themselves up to do a lot of heavy lifting on the OPs and LPs, but Yule had a better idea for them. As Yule walked towards a large gathering of humans and gnolls, all of which were eating breakfast together, a male gnoll spotted Yule, leaping up to his large bare feet and clapping both of his bald fists against his chest plate in a salute. "Morning, warlord!" the gnoll called out, and all the other gnolls leapt to their feet, slamming their fists in the same posture.
Morning, warlord!
Called out the rest of the gnolls, and Yule saw with unhidden annoyance that the females were still only wearing their plate carriers. Yule gave them a salute back, then gestured for them to sit. "Have a seat, fellas." All the gnolls sat down at the same time, and Yule's back gave a single, unrestrained jerk of laughter that he masked by then rolling his shoulders, as if he was uncomfortable under the coat. "Cole, I see you hiding behind Roush. Lean out there, Sergeant Major," Yule chided, reaching down and taking a cup offered by the male gnoll that had spoken before. "Thanks, bud." The gnoll grinned fangedly to the gnoll beside him. "Ha, me bud." Cole leaned forward, having been quite desperately trying to stay hidden behind the taller and larger body of Grouch.
Yes?
"How are we looking?" Yule asked him, but asked the question more as an air filler so he could actually observe the gnolls without it being seen as weird, simply casting his eyes around as he listened to Cole prattle off about their situation. Yule had never been a fan of gnolls, or gnoll-like creatures in media back home. They were usually smelly, grungy, disgusting little furballs that ran around eating people and causing an issue wherever their feet found purchase. Not to mention they were hyena-like, and anything that tried to improve their visage was labeled as furry bait and prone to ridicule. But these guys, well, they looked more like wolves or German shepherds if anything. The more Yule looked at them, the more he saw the obvious hard blur between animal and person. They were ugly, yet handsome. Clearly rangy, but still well-groomed, and held within their faces an animalistic brutality that clashed with their merry eyes and barking laughter. Their heads were by far the most animal, followed by their feet, hands, and tail, but Yule could see where the main body of the gnolls mimicked what he had seen in the harpies. At their core, gnolls were humanoid and shaped as such, all except for the usual 3 key areas: head, feet, hands. Except for the gnolls, they did not have a more humanoid head, and looked completely like an animal in that regard.
Beyond that, we're ready to go as usual. I suspect we'll get into it tonight.
Cole finished, brushing crumbs from his shoulder that kept falling from Grouch's mouth. There are other gnolls, right? Yule asked, clearly off topic. Domino held up a finger.
Well, actually.
How am I not surprised you know? Yule chided, taking a sip from the cup given to him by the nearby gnoll. Domino lowered his eyebrows at Yule, finger still raised, but continued on.
There are 3 gnoll clans. Frostfangs, Whitefeathers, and Longclaws.
Frostfangs are dandies.
One of the female Longclaws muttered, at which the rest of the Longclaws nodded.
Wearing cloth.
Too good for staying wild. Wool chewers.
As the male and female Longclaws continued to grouse about the Frostfangs to themselves, Domino continued.
Frostfangs are the most advanced, building towns along the frozen north and coming down in either river barges or road traders. They are always white, so they're easy to spot.
Domino said.
Get that easier too.
A male gnoll said, and they all chuckled to each other. Domino kept talking, ignoring both the gnolls and Cole, who was angrily yelling at Grouch for still trailing crumbs on him.
Then there are the Whitefeather. They're nomadic and break away from the Frostfangs color-wise, as I'm told they can be brown, blonde, speckled in color, and all that jazz, but are still distinct from both Frostfangs and Longclaws.
Moon gazers, a larger male gnoll said, then held his large hand near his face like he was smoking something.
Flower suckers.
They travel something called the Flower Road or something of that sort, chasing herbs and making their own potions and drugs. Live in semi-static but temporary lodgings they carry with them and deploy them when they find a good hunting ground.
Domino said, taking a long pull from his mug before exhaling with a puff of fog.
Then there are the Longclaws.
All the Longclaws chuckled and barked in laughter to each other, tails thumping against their seats and fists lightly thudding against their plate carriers rhythmically. They quieted down when Domino gave them a "children, please" look, who then turned back to Yule.
Clans are all different. Some are straight up feral, raiding villages or trade roads for goods. Others are semi-civilized, but still hide in the deep wood, doing a little bit of trading here and there. As you can see, they are nearly all multicolored in one way or another, and have those big-ass nails. Then there are clans like this one,
Domino said, gesturing towards the gnolls in front of him.
These fellows come from
Narder barder.
A female gnoll purred out smoothly, admiring a spoon that she had used to eat her mostly protein-filled breakfast.
Narder barder trick dal dinahura.
Domino pressed his lips together, then pointed to the gnoll.
That.
The gnolls all chuckled, but Domino pressed on.
These fellas can't get a name until they're blooded. They're a clan of professional mercenaries and are hoping that they can get 2 names while serving with us.
Domino said, holding up 2 fingers.
Double the name, double the pride, double their clan cred.
Yule blinked, then looked down at the gnoll beside him who was offering to refill his cup with ale. Hold on. If you guys don't have names, then how do we get your attention for orders?
Longclaw,
one gnoll said, pointing his long, dagger-like claw at another gnoll. The gnoll chuckled, then pointed his finger at another gnoll.
Longclaw. Stone Longclaw.
One of the more tawny-colored gnolls said, then pointed to herself with a wide, toothy smile. The gnolls all started tittering with laughter again, and the humans joined in as well, even eliciting a snort from Yule. All right, point and call, Yule said, then gave the cup back to the gnoll. Who is your NCO? The gnoll said, taking Yule's cup. The gnoll looked to the others, eyes wide with question, but all of them shrugged. Pack? Leader? Yule asked, but again they all stared around at each other, unsure. All right, Yule said, shaking his head in exasperation as he pulled out an ancient OCP-backed specialist rank from his own plate carrier pocket, formed in a loop instead of being on Velcro. He looked around, saw the one that had given him the cup looked a little smarter than the others, and bent down. Yule undid the loop of the rank and wound it around the Gnoll's plate carrier strap, making sure it was neatly visible, then clapped his hand on the Gnoll's shoulder. There you go. You're the leader now. The Gnoll dropped both Yule's cup and his own, staring down at his shoulder strap the best he could with wide eyes that seemed to be welling with tears. The rest of the Gnolls looked on with both awe and envy, while the one tawny female pointed to the rank.
What mean?
She asked, looking up at Yule. It's the rank of specialist, Yule said with a nod, and all of the Gnolls looked at the rank-bearing one, pointing their long clawed fingers at him.
Specialist!
They said in unison, and the Gnoll sniffed, face rife with uncomfortable emotions as he earned his first name. He tapped at his chest with both fists, sniffing again before looking up at Yule.
Specialist.
Oh, Lord.
Domino muttered, snoring down at his cup in laughter. Yule gave the now sniffing Gnoll another pat on the shoulder, making damn sure to resist the human urge to pat his head, and folded his arms. I know you spoke about taking these lads out on the recon and counter-recon, but I want them in the trenches.
Why?
Cole asked, narrowing his eyes out of curiosity.
They'd be perfect out there.
Yule chewed on the inside of his lip, then held up an uncrossed hand. We're dealing with magic here, and I remember tall wheat, as do we all. I have an inkling, shall we say, that they're more than willing to try the same thing. They have artillery that outmatches our own, and I'm fairly certain they have smoke.
You're wagering they'll use smoke to cover in an assault?
Domino asked. I would. Yule said, bending his head slightly to scratch at his cheek. I'd shell the shit out of us and then assault the weakest point. I send in troops during shelling, set them up as the shelling peters off, and then lay smoke for them to cover their entry. Specialist stood up, and despite not knowing all of what exactly was said, he heard enough to get the point. As he stood, the other Gnolls stood with him, and they all placed their fists against their plate carriers.
No one gets through these lines.
No one!
The other Gnolls cried out, and you could see in their eyes that they meant it. All right then, Yule said with a smile, and the rest of the humans were smiling around him. Perhaps these little furballs weren't so bad after all. Yule had been relaxing with Alavara in their room when the first shell came down, and he stood to his feet slowly, still in his complete battle uniform. The thud was unmistakable, but it was still far off, far short and off target. Then there was the rattling cracks of gunfire, and Yule walked up to the window, squinting out into the late night darkness. His LPs were staffed with the most veteran of his troops, hidden in the snow or wherever they could find cover, and had the best radios Yule could offer. They were working in tandem with the OPs. The fire teams there dug in deeply and armed to the teeth to repel any contact the LPs ran into. The LPs had the task of sighting recon teams moving along the snow, watching through the sights of their weapons and reporting which direction they were heading. The OPs were then set on high alert, watching and waiting for the recon teams, then engaging them once they came into view. This was all happening 400 yards away, and Yule set his hands on his hips, watching the night. The OPs would not last forever. They would be shelled eventually and would have to fall back to preset OP locations to start all over again. This would continue day by day until Yule would have no more OPs left. Come with me, my love, Yule said, walking back to Alavara and taking her by the hand. Alavara yawned softly, also wearing her uniform.
Where to? You're not going out into the field right now, are you?
No, Yule chuckled, then kissed her hand and helped her to her feet, taking her down to the radio room with him. Alavara knew Yule was stressed, and she also knew that this was going to be an extremely taxing engagement. Even then, she didn't need to caress Yule's mind to know that. It was written all over his face. Alavara and Yule walked into the radio room to an already buzzing murmur of activity as 6 radio men wrote down on paper pads, while in the background NCOs and lone wanderers were poring over local maps of the area. Hackholm herself was there pouring ale for the radio men and turned to nod at Yule before continuing on with her task.
No, don't engage them. Just report to OP Charlie.
A Valley Elf private said into his receiver, marking on a smaller hand-drawn map what was going on.
Do not engage that recon team.
What is going on, Private? Yule asked, leaning over the elf's shoulder to look down at the map. The elf tapped his pencil to the thin paper membrane they'd been laying over the map to keep it from getting ruined.
They came with 4 recon teams. We caught all 4 out in the middle of the snow with the moon shining, so the OPs opened up and raked them with machine gun fire. Then the LPs found 3 more trying to sneak in.
Don't let the ones in the open get away, Yule said lowly, reaching over and tapping the unit availability chart in front of the radio operator. Send in the Himalayas and Hawks to mop them up. Make sure to tell their sparrow handlers that I want bodies intact. The elf nodded, then clicked his radio to another channel.
High Score 3 engaged those recon teams. Yule wants the bodies intact.
Without missing a beat, he then switched the radio's knob again.
All OPs cease fire. Cease fire. High Score 3's engaging.
Yule leaned up and listened, and he heard the distant cracks of gunfire trickle down to nothing. With his eyes still closed, he leaned back down to the elf. How many OPs were lost?
None, sir.
The elf said professionally.
But 2 were hit by artillery. Close enough to force them back. 4 wounded. No SDCs.
After they scoop the recon teams, pull the OPs back to the next preset. They're going to start shelling when that team sends a distress call. Tell the LPs to fall back to their next preset as well, Yule said, then turned away from the elf as he started issuing the commands. Hackholm, thank you for letting us use this room. Alavara, come with me, please. Alavara cocked her head in confusion, but followed Yule outside. A few feet away from the porch, a small cluster of Veil Rider NCOs and Lone Wanderers were standing together, all their arms crossed. Listen, Yule murmured, facing out towards the snowfields. It was faint, but Alavara could just hear the far, far distant war cries of harpies, which wasn't too difficult since they could nearly cause the eardrums to bleed if too close. They all stood there listening as rather unlucky soldiers died in those snowfields, and then the first distant soft thump was heard.
Counting,
Alphonse said, his eyes closed in thought. Alavara breathed out a wisp of foggy breath as she strained her ears, and more of the odd little sounds touched the air. Tump, 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 tump. 5 guns, Yule muttered, shaking his head. God damn it, how did they get 5 guns all the way over here?
They're close enough to hit the town,
Alphonse said with a sigh, uncorking a bottle he had stuffed into his coat.
When they get eyes on us, it's going to be rough.
We just have to push it out as far as we can, Yule said. Then he turned to Alavara, speaking quietly so just the 2 of them could hear. If I asked you to leave, would you? Alavara smiled at Yule, both hearing his thoughts and his words at the same time.
No, Tuve, I would not.
She nearly laughed when she heard Yule loudly curse in his mind, but she managed to just keep it in her smiling lips. A loud, trilling call split the air, and they both looked around towards the sky, spotting the 7 Himalaya and 3 hawk harpies coming down towards them. The lead Himalaya, a strong-looking male who had his hair cropped short, dropped a fully intact Southern Elf body at the bottom of the stairs, fluffing out his feathers triumphantly.
Vrilic, bring elf,
Vrilic said, rolling his head from side to side as the rest of the harpies dropped down with him, bringing both another Southern Elf and an orc.
Human, get away.
Everyone turned at this news, looking at the harpy pensively.
A human? Are you sure?
Roxanne said, one of the original female Veil Riders who have crossed over in the very beginning.
Are you sure it wasn't something else?
Vrilic tapped at his neck with his massive wing claw.
Human wear necklace. Very strong. Very quick.
Yule looked down at the dead Southern Elf, noticing the sad little blood-stained butter bar rank on his OCP ACUs. His body was bloody, wet, and still trailing snow in some places, but there was no ignoring the obvious pair of night vision goggles on his helmet or the DMR rifle still slung around his body. Rifle's new. Says SIG on it, Yule said, crouching down to run his pockets. Reed sniffed down at it, cocking his head to catch the engraved letters in the inn light. 6716G2. Looks fancy. Yule found the little booklet this time and pulled it out, fanning out the pages as he looked inside of it. He found one section of interest and held it up to a nearby hawk harpy. Take that inside to the radio room. Tell them to monitor these frequencies.
Arlo hears.
Arlo said, quickly tapping his way across the wooden boards of the porch and ducking inside the inn. Yule looked over to the other bodies, then slowly let his head tilt towards his right shoulder. They're bringing orcs with them.
Orc had bow when we killed.
Vrillik replied, brushing his bloody talons on the snow-covered grass.
Was not good enough with bow.
The other Himalaya harpy snorted, and Yule stood up when he found nothing else of importance on the elf except for a password-locked cell phone. Well, I guess the first point goes to us, Yule said, then thwacked the bloody snow off his boots by thumping them against the porch step. Gonna be hell tomorrow, though, I just know it.
We'll see,
Alphonse said, already walking out towards the trench line. When Alavara was trying to coax Yule to bed, they passed by the radio room and learned from one of the LPs that the artillery fire had been random and sporadic, leaving no casualties but a lot of churned up dirt. Staying hidden, the LPs had tasked the OPs with sending men out to observe fallen enemy elements and found only a few scattered dead, mostly orcs with a single other southern elf found. Alavara was only able to pull Yule out of the radio room because she caught him yawning, and she ended up taking him by the arm and pulling him away from his radio men. After all, there were NCOs and senior NCOs in that room. They could listen just as well as he could. While she was pulling off her boot, she turned her head and caught Yule sitting on the bed. He was staring out the window towards the snowfields, his back hunched and fingers rubbing something between them. She had thought for a moment he was going over the patches he kept in his pockets, but as she reached out with a mental tendril to caress his mind, she stopped pulling off her last boot.
Yule? Are you okay?
Alavara asked, slowly stepping over towards him as Yule didn't react. She was able to look over his shoulder and see a very old, charred, and filthy name tape in his hands. And Yule was looking past the window, past the snowfields, and as far as Alavara knew, past this entire plain. She remembered the last time she had caught him like this, a few months into the winter, and very gently wrapped her mental coils around him. Alavara stroked his mind and thoughts as if she were trying to run her finger along the flesh of a flower petal, and she placed her hands on Yule's shoulders as he trailed her laces from her loose boot.
Yule?
Alavara asked again, and she felt his entire mind go cold. She kicked off her other boot with a rough shake of her leg, sending it flying across the room into a wall. Alavara then sat behind Yule and wrapped her legs and arms around him, hugging him from behind as she stroked at his face.
Yule, Juve, are you okay?
No, Yule thought, and Alavara waited a few heartbeats before hugging him tighter.
Is something wrong, Yule?
Alavara hushed into his ear, running the back of her hand down his cheek as he still stared out past the plains. She worked her mental tendrils around him, the spectral vines picking and working at the man's mind, until finally a little glimmer of warmth broke past the chilly cold. Just old memories, Yule finally said after a long time, his voice a level of tired Alavara had never heard before. I don't like artillery, and this is a kind of familiar situation to one I had before. Alavara heard the ghostly crackle of fire and she blinked her eyes, both relieved and now worried all over again.
Do you want to talk about it?
Not generally, Yule murmured, his eyes finally coming back to the current reality and looking down at the name tape in his fingers. It was not a good time. Alavara rubbed her cheek against Yule's shoulder as she placed her hands on his upper chest.
Well, I think you could tell me about it a little at least. Help me understand why you go quiet and stare off into the distance like you're peering through time itself.
Yule hummed in his throat, his back rumbling against her chest, and Alavara thought he was going to deny her again until he started speaking quietly. It was a short war, just over 20 years. Yule said, reaching up and laying a hand over one of Alavara's. It was not a good war, but it was the only one we had. The sounds and flickers of images started to leak from Yule, and she very slowly enclosed her mental tendrils around them like an unseen cocoon. It was a mess, to be frank. The goals were not outlined, vague, kept changing. But then again, all our wars were like that, it seemed like. Yule said, pulling away Alavara's hand and looking at it, his eyes trailing down the creases of her palm. About 8, 9 years into it, it started getting rough. We pushed out into a place called Afghanistan. Alavara's ears perked up to the odd name, and she smiled as Yule slowly trailed his thumb down her hand.
Afghanistan. What was it like?
It was a place of beauty, marred by the ugly scars of religious skirmishes, doctrines, and foreign powers warring inside of it. Yule said without hesitation, slowly turning Alavara's hand in his. When it was morning and the sun rising, you could catch a glimpse of how the place could be in peace, true peace. Rolling mountains and valleys of green, alpine meadows and woodlands, all pushing against the rocky sands of the desert. It was beautiful to me. I would have scoured the earth clean of the tribals who lived there if just to preserve that feeling in the morning. Alavara did her best to not recoil at the sudden urge of hatred and bloodlust that pulsed off of Yule like a shockwave, instead just curling her fingers and rubbing them along his. That is not completely fair, though. Yule continued. The people were just trying to live their lives in those mountains. The real problem were the armed zealots trying to maintain control. Alavara tilted her head against Yule's shoulder.
Were they bad humans?
Yes. Yule said quietly, and suddenly a flood of images poured into Alavara's mind like a stream breaking free of winter ice. They were very bad humans. As Yule spoke, she could clearly see what he saw as he remembered, and Alavara braced herself against Yule like a sailor waiting for the crushing ocean wave looming towards them. They were an evil people, driven by the religious fervor of the Islamic faith being twisted. If you asked a lot of us, we no longer cared about the war at large. We only cared about killing these people who we saw as monsters. We dehumanized them to the point we saw them as nothing more than animals, and we slaughtered them with abandon not marred by guilt. Alavara heard an odd language in her mind and saw the faces of the men Yule must have been describing. They were a rough-looking people with tan skin and seemed to be wearing large black face wrappings with headbands bearing a scrolling language. She cleared her throat before she spoke.
What exactly made you hate them? Was it merely the creed they lived by, or was it something far darker?
They ripped away the rights of the people under their control. We had many names for them, like Taliban, and they never failed to disappoint. Women had no rights, no autonomy, they killed on a whim and with impunity, and rape was always on their menu, Yule murmured. We knew they hated us nearly as much as we hated them, and we took the rifle to each other. It got to the point we would find wounded and kill them anyway, not reporting any survivors back to command. There was the Battle of Wanat, then Kamdesh, and we surged in troop count. I was sent out with the rest of my unit to secure another village that they were afraid of coming under attack. I believe they were wanting to make another combat outpost in it, but it never got to that point, Yule said, lifting his head and looking out the window. We had barely even parked the trucks when the artillery came down. Alavara heard the thuds and explosions of artillery pull away from Yule's mind, and she closed her eyes as a tendril wrapped around it, drawing it closer to her own. She lightly scratched her nails against Yule's chest as she focused on the memory and placed herself inside of it, looking around at the chaos as the mental barrier between them popped like a thin bubble. She heard Yule and turned her head as the streaking, ghostly memories of soldiers ran around her. He was younger here, his clean-shaven face a snarl of anger as he yelled at his squad to get to cover. There were others, too. The same hard-faced men from the other memory were running away, scooping up children while pushing their wives to the safety of cover. The noise was deafening, the slightly muted rumble of guns firing and artillery coming down around her. Alavara squinted her eyes from within this memory, trying to drag it more into focus as an explosion ripped a large vehicle into shreds of metal. We later learned they had captured 122mm Soviet artillery from our allies, who had fled from battle at just the opening exchange of fire some days before, Yule said, and the voice sounded deeper to her as she slowly walked through the ambush. She had only done this once before to Yule during the ice months, having accidentally fallen into his dream and having to hide within something called a Kroger. He had just been dreaming that time, trying to find some kind of drink that wasn't in stock, but here, with him narrating, time seemed to slow as he spoke. It was accurate, and frankly, I have very little doubt they weren't using direct fire. The rounds came down right on top of us, and the AMRAPs weren't able to handle that much high explosive. Yule sat around her, and the memory sped forward as Yule stopped speaking, falling back into his mind. The explosions rained down around them, ripping the ground apart and throwing chunks of earth into the air with the concussions of shockwaves. Alavara blinked at the shredded vehicles and the screaming around her, as it was all so foreign yet at the same time so familiar. The snap and crack of bullets passing by her made her look down the street, and she saw figures lunging towards the little convoy, their rifles spitting out skits of sparks. We had to move, and we had to start pulling back. We lost 3 trucks, and we knew more artillery was going to come down. There were fighters coming down the street towards us, so we started falling back down the road, back the way we came. Yule said, the words wrapping around her as time quickly spun forward, and she felt the ground shift under her feet. One of my troopers hadn't gotten out of the truck fast enough, and it was hit. He was trapped in the wreckage, and a lot of his legs were missing. I had slung my rifle and was trying to pull him out, but I couldn't jerk him loose. Alavara crouched down, resting on her knees as she watched Yule yelling and pulling on a heavily wounded man who kept pushing him away. Alavara pressed her lips into a sad line as she watched Yule try desperately to pull the man from the wreckage. But the man yelled at the soldiers behind Yule, yelling out in a language she couldn't understand. Yule struck out at them and tried to turn back to the wounded man, but the other soldiers grabbed Yule by his arms and plate carrier. He bellowed at them to let him go as more soldiers fired down the street with machine guns, covering the retreat of the convoy, and Alavara walked beside them as the memory began to blur and fuzz behind her. Yule could not remember what he could not have seen, the memory coming out of focus and out of time. Alavara stood there in the brass casing and charred steel-filled street, watching the soldiers pull Yule away as he howled out in a rage. He didn't make it, Yule said shortly, and Alavara could see the man's name tape still clutched in his bloody gloved hand as he was dragged away, time slowing again as Yule spoke. I had never lost a single trooper for so many years. I thought I was invincible, that death themselves couldn't get a hand on my men. The memory began to fade, and Alavara slowly picked up her feet, stepping along the tendril that had brought her there as Yule's voice echoed in her ears, carrying her away from the old memory. I was wrong. It was like a domino effect. After my first, it was like I couldn't stop losing men. Yule murmured, and Alavara looked down past the mental tendril under her feet. Below her feet, memories were playing out as if she was walking above a dozen stages, each with its own actors following their scripts. Sniper fire, IEDs, they lose a leg or become disfigured by explosives. It started taking a toll on me. All of the stages dwindled away one by one, fading away into the shadows as if someone had blown them out like candles, until one remained. Alavara willed her mental tendril to bend down, carrying her towards this memory, and she sat down onto her heels, wrapping her arms around her knees as she watched. I broke after a big firefight. We were ambushed, as it always seemed like we were, and I managed to only lose one trooper. It was his first rotation out on a deployment, and he was barely even 20 years old. Yule's broken voice faltered around her, and Alavara frowned as his emotions fell around her like rain. He caught some shrapnel from an RPG, blew out his neck and made a mess of him. There was nothing we could do. There were prisoners, about 6 of them, and we had them all gathered up near our trucks. Alavara looked down below at a young man laying on the ground, machine gun beside him, and it was one she knew, the M240 Bravo. The rough-looking, dark-skinned men pointed at the dead young man and all laughed with bright white teeth. She saw Yule jerk around, his face livid. They were laughing at him right in front of me. It was just one step too far down the road. All the memories of women from those villages beaten to death for honor, the child brides, the whippings, the sadism. Alavara breathed in deep as Yule stepped over, snatched up the machine gun, then leveled it at the group of prisoners. Her heart was pounding in her chest like a frightened deer as she watched all the prisoners look towards Yule, and all his soldiers suddenly lurch into action, yelling and holding out their hands to try and grab him. I was done, and so were they. The smiles died on the prisoners' lips as their eyes went wide, and Yule pulled back on the trigger. And that's the end of Chapter 5 for the Veil Rider Book 4. If you like the story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbro's Field Desk, comment down below, join the Discord, and share the story with your friends who you may think will like the story. If you want teasers and see the work in progress of book art, be sure to join the coffee on one of the memberships. There's $5, $25, and $50 memberships. All of you get access to the members-only Discord, channel on the Discord where you can see teasers. Each echelon gets a certain amount of teaser. The squad gets about a couple sentences. E4 gets a paragraph, and the first shirts get a whole page of teaser. A huge shout out to my first shirts. That's Insane Medic, Death Dancer, Cody Giro, and E Machino. These guys are fucking stellar and constantly help the channel out, and I honestly probably couldn't be here without a lot of these guys. they really keep me going here. Not to be left behind are the E4 Mafia. That's Splug the Goblin, Snitty Enjoyer, who I always love seeing his fucking name, because it's just fucking Snitty Enjoyer. Dark Side, Kiwi Bastard, Lacuna 8, Lacune, Josh Beatty, Matty Boy, Flash of Green, and Crusader 0625. And of course, a huge thank you to all of Snuffy Squad, all you out there on the all the snuffers. That's what the hell is this? Oh, I'm the Lore Smith, Duncan D, Inquisitor Matt, Anto, Coffee Commander, Diesel Dog, Ranger Uninspired, Classic Cthulhu, Kite Xero, Skelters, Yeti Potato, Andrew N. Gill, Devin Schonholtz, Thrace Vega, Blonde Lord, Wololo, Jules, Dalek, Henry DM, and Karina. Until we see you next time on this side of the veil, that was Simba, Fire, Rue, Hailey, Technoward, Eliza VTuber, and we'll... Ooh, Jesus. Sorry. We'll see you next time. Ugh.